Okay, and thanks for inviting me, Sepideh. So yeah, today, I mean, the title of my talk is "Phantastic Sound and the Topos of Noise." Last week, so we had a session with the artists. I'd kind of talked a bit about more the fantastic sound side of things, and I don't want to recapitulate too much of that, but I will just give a little explanation of what I mean by that first. And yeah, hopefully some of you or most of you have read the piece Topos of Noise, which has been shared in the reading, and I'm going to be kind of presenting the argument from that, but I'm going to try and do it without following the text too much, without referring to it. So I'm going to present it in a slightly different way. So yeah, the why is sound fantastic with a PH? So well, it's called that. I mean, I'm taking that from this article by Friston, and he's used it in a few other places as well. So the quote from that article says here, predictive processing shifts away from the brain as a passive filter of sensations, or an elaborate stimulus-response link, towards a view of the brain as a statistical organ that generates hypotheses or fantasies that are tested against sensory evidence. In short, the brain is now considered a fantastic organ, from the Greek phantastikos, the ability to create mental images. Okay, so so basically the reference here then is to this shift in cognitive science that happened around 10, 15 years ago, really, where there was a massive reconceptualization or synthesis of previously opposed accounts. One important way in which it's in, so previously there was a kind of opposition between top-down accounts and bottom-up accounts of perception, and so one of the most important aspects of the PP model is that it says that both of these things are happening, and that there's a kind of interplay between the top-down processes and the bottom-up processing, right? Okay, so the idea of predictive processing is, it presents a kind of lean model of cognition, right, as a computational process. So its kind of main premise in some way is that the brain doesn't need to take information from the world and analyze it exhaustively and then attribute kind of meaning to it. Instead, what it's doing is predictively projecting a model of the world, and then all it needs to do is to register how the world differs from that model, and then there's just a small bit of updating that it needs to do, so to account for the difference between its model of the world and the sensory, the actual sensory effects that it's getting. So basically, you can think of this as a process of statistical estimation of what's considered in this PPA account random variables. So the stimuli of the external world are considered random variables that are statistically estimated, right, by tracking the various different spatial and temporal scales. And there's again a leanness to this, right, in the sense that kind of tracking details at one temporal or spatial scale should help with other details at a different temporal scale. So, I mean, you can think about this in, for example, music. You've got the bass line and then the hi-hat both of them kind of track each other. If you know what the bass is, then you should be able to know what the hi-hat is, and vice versa, right? Then the whole of this process then is, on the PP account, geared towards the long-term reduction of prediction error, or the long-term reduction of uncertainty, or what's called prediction error minimization, right? So the senses are giving this kind of contact with the world, right? But they're only kind of used to update the error signal. So that it's the error signal which is vitally important to the process of updating this predictive model, right? And of course, there's many ways in which cognitive systems might kind of increase their uncertainty in the short term, but the idea here is that their long-term average uncertainty should be reduced via this process, right? We got some noise. Yeah, thanks. Okay. The way that this happens on a PP model is through Bayesian inference. Okay, so it's supposed to accord with the kind of ideals of Bayesian inference, but kind of over the long term again. So it's approximate Bayesian inference. Then there's, okay, so the predictive processing kind of takes, well, different authors from predictive processing take different philosophical antecedents, but the most kind of cited one is Kant, right? So Kant is seen as a progenitor of the kind of theoretical viewpoint that predictive processing takes, right? Most importantly, kind of this Copernican turn where it's not the objects that conform to thought. It's not thought that conforms to the objects, but the objects that conform to thought, right? But also kind of very importantly, Kant's theory of schematism. So Kant's theory of schematism is supposed to answer the problem of perception, right? How do we recognize an object under the variability, right, of the object, the form of the object, and of its background conditions. So the go-to example in Kant and in deep learning is the recognition of dogs. So obviously a dog can come in many forms. It can also come in many angles or different positions and very many backgrounds. So how do we recognize it? So, I mean, Kant's answer is, or Kant poses the problem as one of how does particularity and how to bridge particularity and generality. So the generality of the understanding with the particularity of sensory intuitions, right? And his answer is that it's the productive imagination which shares features of both. So it has a certain particularity and a certain generality that enables it to kind of act as a bridge between the two. And in predictive processing, then this is kind of updated to kind of the updated explanation of this is that the schemata is something like a generative model, right? Again, an important kind of aspect of this is the idea of analysis by synthesis, right? So Kant was kind of answering this question, against Hume's theory of association, right? So Kant thought that the theory of association could never kind of account for the complexity of object recognition given the variability of those forms and their backgrounds. And I should note here that variability is another term for noise, and variability are effectively the same, have the same meaning, or noise is considered in terms of variability in many scientific papers, right? Okay, so so analysis by synthesis, that's right. Okay, so the idea then is that we are able to analyze, to pick out a dog by having something like a rule. Kant will call it a rule, but in predictive processing, it's more like a set of priors, okay, or a generative model that allows for the synthesis of that object, right? So if you have a rule for constructing dogs, for constructing dog-like images, then you will be able to recognize dogs by producing that image within yourself, effectively, right? Okay. Oh yeah, and so another kind of a big philosophical antecedent for predictive processing theory is Helmholtz, who's of course a Kantian himself, and the main idea from Helmholtz is the idea of perceptual inference. So Helmholtz thought you could understand what's happening in perception as something like an unconscious process that is something similar to scientific hypothesis generation and testing. So every perception on this account is an inference to, at least the intentional content of it is an inference, right? So I have, if I think I see a tree over there, that's an inference to the best kind of explanation for the sensory effects that I'm registering. But then there's also another important way that predictive processing says we minimize uncertainty, and that's by what it calls active inference. So active inference is moving in the world in such a way that uncertainty is reduced. And that can be in two ways. Like one kind of, kind of obvious perceptual example, if I think I see something, which is partially obscured, then I can move my head to reduce uncertainty and see what it is, for example, right? But the other important way, okay, is something like a cybernetic theory, right? Which is that the organism or the cognitive agent has a set of expectations, right? About the world, including, for example, the expectation that its internal temperature should be within a certain range of viability. So if it finds itself outside of these expectations, right, so this will be something like this will trigger something like an error signal, right? And it will need to do something to move in order to kind of reduce the uncertainty. So example here, if you're cold, your body starts shivering. That's an active inference that is going to reduce, or increase your temperature. And even further, you could put on some clothes. Okay. So another couple of important aspects of the predictive processing model is the idea motor principle, which is taken from William James. So William James kind of understood that our kind of mental understanding of what it is to, okay, how do we kind of how do we tell our brain, how does our brain tell our arm to move, right? William James kind of says there that we will have the brain would have a model of the sensory effects of the completed action, and that would be the best thing to send to the arm. So effectively, the sensory effects of doing the action are, you're telling your body to produce those effects, right? And that's how your arm is being moved. So under the PP explanation, okay, effectively you're kind of generating a counterfactual hypothesis, right? You're saying, kind of, okay, I want to move my arm so it's waving. So I predict that my arm is waving, and since I register then an error signal because my arm is not waving, then the best way of reducing uncertainty would be to start waving. Then the arm does it. This is the PP account. And I mean, basically the idea motor principle, what it kind of underlying it is this kind of idea that there's a kind of common language between kind of different motor aspects of the body and perceptual aspects, right? So our ability to see somebody waving is the same as our ability to produce waving in ourselves, and they're all the same kind of code, effectively, right? Okay, another really important aspect of predictive processing theory, specifically with regard to noise, is the idea, the conceptualization of attention there. Okay, so what the brain is on this PP account continually supposed to be tracking the first order regularities of the world, right? Which are kind of the causal structures in the world, which is forming models or hypotheses of, in order to reduce uncertainty. So those are kind of, again, thought of as random variables, which it's statistically estimating, and these are first order variables, right? But it's also tracking second order variables, right? Which is the precision of the predictions that it's making about those variables. Okay, so every time that there's a statistical estimation of some variable, there's also a precision estimation on that prediction. And the precision estimation has to do with the gain on the error signal. Okay, so if we expect the sensory signal to be precise, then an error signal will be highly weighted. Okay, so it will travel up the hierarchy of the predictive processing system, and a lot of computational resources will be dedicated to finding out, to explaining away this error signal, right? In the opposite situation, for example, if we're in a noisy situation like a blizzard or a noisy bar, then your sensory signals are likely to be less precise. So that means you're going to give more weight to the top-down model, right? What your expectations are. So attention is something like turning the gain on the sensory error signals. And it's also, about kind of directing computational resources. So, I mean, this is also experience. If you're paying attention to a sound, you're also kind of, putting more computational resources into the processing of that auditory signal, and you're kind of giving less weight to your expectations. Okay, then one of the kind of implicit aspects of this predictive model is the idea of environmental seclusion. So this is the idea that the brain, or the cognitive agent, doesn't have direct access to either the states of the environment or its own body. So it's continually kind of generating predictions and hypotheses about both of these. Now, this is a kind of contentious aspect of the model. So there are various people who argue for a kind of strong idea of environmental seclusion, which is bound by the brain. Others who kind of stress a more embodied approach, and so take this environmental seclusion rather differently. We'll come to some of those ideas later. And I mean, let me just say a little bit about that in more detail. So the predictive model's entirely self-generated, and it has no direct access to the causal processes underlying dynamic state changes, either in the external world or its own body. So its capacity to model those causal structures are, of course, crucial to its survival. But in some way, in the predictive processing account, it's interoceptive and proprioceptive inference. Okay, so inference is about where my body is in space and how my body feels. Those are more fundamental, because the system has to first distinguish itself from its environment, which is called primary alienation. And that includes modeling the difference between changes in sensory states caused by environmental changes and those that are self-caused. And I mean, you can think of that, like, for example, if you look at anyone's eyes, they're kind of moving around continuously. You don't we don't see that, right? When we're looking out into the world, I don't see kind of sudden shifts because our brain is computing that movement and effectively kind of minusing it. What's the word? Minusing, taking it away from the predictive model, right? So there's plenty of kind of ways in which the self-caused movement is kind of dynamically kind of reduced in its impact in our perceptual model, right? So the internal processes and spatial position of the body are modeled by generating expectations of the sensory states that would result if a certain action were performed, and then testing these hypotheses, right? And this is, again, Helmholtz would understand this in terms of kinesthetic modifications. And so he talked about a kind of what if model of perception. So this fits that, but yeah. So the idea that we can kind of do these kind of active inferences that bring the world into I mean, Friston calls it kind of bending the world to fit our expectations, right? This kind of adds another kind of layer onto the top of this kind of idea of what if, right? So the general account says, the agents engaged in minimizing surprisal. So surprisal is the technical term here from Shannon, which is the negative log probability of an event's occurrence. Right, but the quantification of surprisal requires that an agent has something like a totalized map of its possibility space. If it were to quantify this kind of in some objective or external vantage point. But so the idea here is that, okay, although we have finite computational resources and this kind of quantification is effectively impossible, there's the ongoing process of minimizing the difference between expected sensory states and actual sensory states is effectively produces this kind of long-term average maintenance of a lower limit on surprisal. And that's it's Friston's free energy principle, which kind of states that the general economy of the predictive agent is directed towards this intrinsically constituted difference, right? So it doesn't require a vantage point outside of itself. And here another little bit of technical detail here. So the free energy we're talking about here, the idea comes from thermodynamics. So in thermodynamics, free energy is bound energy, and it refers to the quantity of work that can be usefully extracted from a system. But the free energy here is not the same, but it's closely related information theoretic quantity used in statistics, and it's called variational free energy. That measures statistical probability distributions and provides a method of optimally updating a generative model of the causal structure of some data source according to new evidence. So variational free energy minimization, also known as variational Bayes, is used in a lot of machine learning systems to convert difficult integration problems into easier kind of optimization problems. So, for example, all of those like AlphaGo and like many of those systems are using variational free energy minimization. So, okay, on this model, so biological systems can, both in their physiology and their behavior can be understood as implicit models or representations of the causal dynamics of their external milieu. So related to the maintenance of essential variables. So, for example, shark skin denticles model the turbulent dynamics of water, or scatter hoarding behavior of rodents or birds model fluctuations in the availability of food sources and the possibility of their discovery. So the idea then is that biological agents act to maximize the evidence for that model and implicitly for their own existence. Okay. So under this kind of model, all perception is fantastic. But there's a specificity to the fantastic nature of sound. So I'll talk about that a little bit before coming back to predictive processing and its problems. So it's because a heard sound is intrinsically durational and its source often obscured, or its content multi-layered, that it reveals what can remain shrouded in the glaring immediacy or transparent presence of vision, which is the cognitively constructed and conceptually mediated nature of perception. So I don't want to give a kind of sonic essentialism here or something, so it's nothing about it's not to say to put sound higher than the other senses here. It's about the specificity of it, and then I think the difference, the difference shouldn't be overstated. So the opposition between auditory and visual modalities on the basis that auditory concerns dynamic and immersive events, and vision concerns static detached objects is kind of wrong. So I think this is, I put in your further reading list a book by Stephen Handel, and so I think his explanation here is brilliant. So he's saying that though different sensory modalities have different medium-specific forms of realization, there's a coherent set of design principles that underlie the distinctive forms, and they not only kind of phenomenologically cohere in a multimodally integrated percept, but they're also functionally united in being geared towards accomplishing the distinction between coherent structure and noise, right? And here, coherent structure is effectively kind of spatial and temporal objects, events or agents, causal structures in the world, right? So he says listening, seeing, grasping, smelling, and tasting are fundamentally the same. Although the sensory inputs and sensory receptors are quite different in structure and operation, the actual contrasts may be different, all function by partitioning and contrasting structure and noise. So fundamentally, perception consists in kind of context-relative differences or contrasts, such as variations in intensity against a background condition, or changes in the relative vibration patterning that characterizes objects. So rather than some kind of uniform or indifferent readout of the quantity of energy striking the sensory receptor, what's registered by sensation is a kind of local degree of energetic excitation What's perceived is a global object determined by contrast, by changes and contrasts. And that's a function of prediction and not registration. So, you know, another kind of way in which vision and sound are opposed often is like, you know, people, you know, sound bends around things. We don't have this thing of like not being able to, you know, like in vision, you see, things can be obscured by something else. You can't see it. And sonically, this doesn't happen in the same way, but there is a way in which it's happened, right? So sounds can be masked from hearing, just as visual objects can be obstructed from sight. So sounds are drowned out and visual objects are hidden. Again, this concerns the distinction between structure and noise and the need to overcome various obstructions to the apprehension of objects, where objects are causal sources. So basically, we can say that you know, hearing is an active, task-related and context-specific, meaningful synthesis rather than a passive analytic registration of frequencies and amplitudes. And again, this is something I talked about a bit more last week. There's this kind of, you know, impossibility of a totalizing representation of sound related to what's called the time-frequency trade-off. Also duration bandwidth reciprocity, and that's analogous to quantum indeterminacy and underlain by the same principles. So in quantum systems, you've got conjugated variables such as position and velocity, which display indeterminacy relations. And similarly in sound analysis, duration and spectrum are complementary quantities. So that if we have a sharply defined frequency value, then time value becomes indeterminate. And so frequency resolution necessarily creates timing uncertainty and vice versa. You know, and we can see this in kind of technical terms. You know, there's various kind of means of sound representation and analysis. You know, analog and digital, and various ways of doing it. So, you know, but there's no kind of there's no way of achieving a kind of complete elimination of spectral and temporal uncertainty. And you know, every kind of real technical system that of audio analysis involves some kind of transmission noise, some compromise in the navigation of those trade-offs, and some ambiguity in the detection and representation of the signal. So, I mean, another kind of way in which sound is fantastic in this sense then is that you know, the sensation of sound, the phenomenological appearance of it is a cognitive construct within a certain kind of window of simultaneity, a certain kind of thickness of presence, right? Which again, William James called a specious present, and you know, this is, for example, like the sensation of a tone is, it happens when human perception reaches attentional limits where micro events are occurring too quickly in succession to be heard as discrete events. So the auditory system, which is nonlinear, reorganizes these events into a group. And, you know, there's many other kind of technical aspects of kind of the auditory system that we can show that, you know, that it doesn't correspond to any kind of simple stimulus response device. There's a kind of active nonlinear processes of amplification of, you know, very small signals and inhibition of large signals and a kind of running computation of the temporal dynamics of it, and so on. So hearing isn't just a matter of meaningless kind of computational adequation, but meaningfully navigating in a noisy world. And that means finding correspondences between registered sensory signals, distinguishing between figure and ground, segregating or streaming information from different perceptual objects, again against the constant varying background noise, disambiguating equivocal stimuli, and projecting the integrated information onto inferred causal sources. So then, yeah, we can talk about the fantastic nature of sound, this kind of more kind of in terms of the more technical implementation details of auditory cognition, and we can also kind of give a more kind of a different account, a deep historical evolutionary account of the specificity of human auditory cognition, right? Which is something that evolved and wasn't given, right? We have a particular kind of capacity to kind of to be able to cognize, very long rhythmic chains, and that is something that we can. I mean, this I'm taking here from Gary Tomlinson. There's a good explanation of our kind of the development of those auditory capacities by a process of biosocial co-evolution, right? So it's his argument there is that kind of proto-musicking and proto-languaging there was a communicative bifurcation between those, and that they co-developed as two different kind of modes of communication. One, language being progressively capable of making precise references to objects, intentional objects, right? Even when they are not present, right? And the other, musicking, being capable of a kind of reference that was very different. That is, I mean, what another philosopher, Ian Cross, calls this aspect of musicking. He says there's something like a floating intentionality in the kind of in the way that we receive musical information, different from the referentiality there of language. So this is another way in which sound is fantastic, in the kind of cultural sense in which music operates, right? And I may come back to this later. Let's just say here now. Okay, we want to go back to the problems with predictive processing. So, as I've said, philosophical antecedents usually taken to be Kant and Helmholtz. There's a good argument by one theorist who considers second-order cybernetics, so Ashby's second-order cybernetics, to be a better model. But I mean, I think in general we could say, like, effectively, predictive processing is quite an individualist model of cognition. So it doesn't really account for the collective or social nature of cognition. It starts from the position of the cognitive agent. It kind of assumes environmental seclusion and a kind of poverty of environmental stimulus. that has to be enriched by the agent's information processing. It assumes the cognitive agent receives information, kind of construed neutrally, and then attributes meaning to it by inference. And there's a number of routes towards providing a different account. So one is via kind of embodied phenomenology, following people like Merleau-Ponty. Another is through kind of ecological psychology, kind of referring to the Gibsons, and another connected route is through kind of an activism, so people like Varela and Di Paolo, there's various ways in which these three kind of routes lead to reconceptualizations of predictive processing. Now, let's just quickly run through why or how those things might help us. Okay, so Husserl is, the founder of phenomenology, is criticized generally for a detached perspective of observation. There's a whole kind of Heideggerian kind of lineage of critique for that. It also kind of criticized because of the notion of transcendental reduction. So many of people have argued about the impossibility of that. Also kind of his essentialism, supposedly. I think, though, you have to be careful with some of those criticisms. I mean, one thing is, his philosophy of perception does stress embodiment, and I mentioned earlier that this idea of kinesthetic modifications that was central to his account, and this is very similar to Helmholtz. This kind of idea of the subjunctive, like what if nature of perception, and okay, an important aspect of Husserl's model then is something like there's something like an implicit topological view, right? So the idea of transcendental reduction, for example, is supposed to be the extraction of the invariant essence of the phenomenon through the process of variation, right? And the variations include kinesthetic modifications and so on. Merleau-Ponty, of course, is shifts the account of phenomenology towards to add much more stress on this kind of embodied nature of perception. I think again, what's interesting here is that although kind of Merleau-Ponty is generally seen as anathema to something like Kant, because he's very kind of anti. First of all, he's anti-representation, and he's also anti this kind of intellectual, this view of kind of the mind as something something disembodied, right? So, but there's a massive continuity. So Merleau-Ponty also sees the problem of perception as one that has to answer how we bridge particularity and generality. And his answer is also very similar to Kant's, in that he's saying, it's the productive imagination which is able to bridge that via schematisms. And here it's the body schema, which is so it's the body that thinks in Merleau-Ponty, but it's this bodily thinking is what is enabling this bridging between those two things. And again, we can see this in as well. on a predictive processing account, that would have to be allied with something like a generative model in the brain as well. So another route is through Gibson's environmental psychology. And so here the important idea is that, okay, so Gibson's criticizing the idea that the brain is, that the external world has some kind of unstructured information, and that the brain is the thing that structures it, right? By processing that information. So he's arguing, or they rather, because it's two Gibsons, they're arguing that for a notion of environmental information. So the idea here is that the way in which the world varies. There are regularities to the way in which, you know, the world and our senses systematically vary. So for Gibson, you know, what we don't perceive information, we perceive affordances, right? Affordances being action opportunities of the object. And so, I mean, in this respect, you know, we can think of, you know, the generative model. Let's go back to the example of the dog. If we have a generative model of a dog, the generative model of the dog on Gibson's account, right, is are the action potentials of the dog. So it includes kind of the action of stroking it, the action of throwing a ball, this kind of thing. Our understanding of the dog is the possibility of actions involving a dog. And I mean, yeah, so ecological information is directly present in the lawful relation or systematic covariation between objective causes and qualitative change. And there's a similar regularity in elicited sensory motor schemas or meanings for the agent. So we don't perceive objects or events as such in the sense of neutral kind of qualitative material whose identity then we then infer, but we perceive meaningful affordances structures, and they may be structural invariants, which are persistent features, or transformational invariants, changing features. This was something I mentioned last week. For example, the timbre of a trombone is a structural invariant over melody. The sliding change of pitch is a transformational invariant within it. And so here again, you know, structural and transformational invariants are intrinsically topological. Both are structure-preserving transformations describing morphological continuities and discontinuities. Okay, so, and, you know, another route is via the inactivist kind of line. So this comes from the work of Maturana and Varela, that here kind of an autopoietic system is an autonomous system with two interconnected features. One is that it continually produces itself materially or dynamically under precarious conditions. Okay, so and that precariousness has to do with a certain kind of openness to noise of the system. And then secondly, in this way, it establishes a kind of concerned or partial point of view on its environment, right? So it doesn't neutrally see the environment. There's an appearance of the environment for it that is related to its concerns or its needs, and its possibilities for action. So the key kind of move is the replacement of the kind of representational approach to cognition which treats this kind of, which assumes a kind of neutral information processing with a dynamic approach where it understands that information in terms of patterns of agent-environment interactions. And then, so Varela goes on to give more, a dynamicist account of the way in which neural processing works via kind of cell assemblies and their kind of their phase locking and so on. Now, one other kind of line where we route that can come through this is so Petitot, and this is something I talk about in the Topos of Noise quite a bit. So Petitot kind of reconceptualizes Husserl's phenomenology via the work of René Thom. So the cognitive system is then conceived as a dynamic attractor landscape. Okay, so this is a kind of close to the inactivist account, and so he's proposing what he calls morphodynamical functionism, where and so on this model, so it inverts kind of the order of priority in this kind of standard model of computation. So in the standard or classical model of cognition, the computationalist model of cognition, you have a syntax, syntactical operations, moving symbols around, produce meaning, semantics, right? But here it's semantics first. So the brain is first of all, and I mean, basically we so the idea in activist approach, they're talking about sense making rather than information processing. So the sense making of the cognitive agent is in Petitot understood as to work via kind of image schemata, which are effectively kind of attractors on a kind of dynamic landscape. And I mean, the example that I talk about a little bit in the Topos of Noise paper is so he draws on this distinction that Husserl makes between verschmelzen and sondering. They're called as the terms in Husserl. So verschmelzen, I forget which way around they are now, but okay, effectively. Yes, I think so. Verschmelzen, I think, is the differentiation, and sondering the smoothing. Okay, so the idea is that let me just see here. There we are. The idea is that so. I mean, perhaps best to explain this via. So I put this kind of quote of Kant a quote of Badiou about Kant in the Topos of Noise piece. So he says, Kant perfectly understood what the problem of perception has to do with degrees. Okay, so what in Kant is called the intensive magnitude, right? All intuitions are of an extensive magnitude, but all perceptual objects are intensive magnitudes, right? Which have degrees of difference in their kind of, for example, color or sound or whatever, right? And Husserl is saying, how do we kind of see something like grass as green, right? Considering there's a variation in the intensive manifold, right? And Husserl, his argument is that there's something like a process of decomposition down to the smallest kind of smallest points that is non-differentiable, let's say, right? So the smallest bit of green that you can find that is not changing, right? And then a kind of gluing of those sections together, right, for a synthesis. So okay, the idea is that kind of, well, in finding objects, in recognizing objects, we need to find, first of all, the boundaries of the objects, right? The discontinuities that are the boundaries of them. And, you know, so those need to be, those discontinuities need to be enhanced. And the continuities in, so for example, the different greenness of grass need to be smoothed, because otherwise we're going to see the set of grass as totally different objects, right? So there needs to be a smoothing and a continuity, and at the same time as a discontinuity. So Petitot's kind of example here of a kind of morphodynamical functionalist account of that is that, you know, there exists an algorithm that does something like this, right? And this is actually used in denoising images. It's called an anisotropic diffusion algorithm. Okay. So, I mean, lastly, there's a route via Metzinger's neurophenomenology, so which gives an account of our phenomenological perception via this idea of the phenomenological self-model. Okay, then his argument is that our experience is a low-dimensional projection of a high-dimensional reality. Our conscious experience of that world is sub part of the cognitive processes in our brain, which enables flexibility and control. But effectively, on his account, it's illusory in the sense that it's produced by neurological dynamics that it doesn't have access to, right? So I think that can be helpful in providing a more kind of a different account of the, although, you know, Metzinger is certainly aligned with predictive processing. I think with his explanation of the predictive of the phenomenal self-model and a kind of an understanding of the way in which sociality structures our perception, then I think we've got something like a means of at least complexifying the predictive processing account and perhaps of kind of critically engaging with it. So, and I think, you know, another thing that is helpful here then is Badiou's objective phenomenology. So Badiou, in his book, The Logic of Worlds, he's describing the logic of appearing. And so he's distinguishing his account of being, the being of being, right, which is which he grounds in classical logic, and for him the being of appearing, or the appearing in itself, should be understood according to an intuitionistic logic. This is something we could talk about later. The important point here is that for for Badiou, he's saying, that, the accounts of, Kant and Husserl and so on, all phenomenological accounts are based on the constituent subject, right? The way in which the subject constitutes its world. And this is very close to the idea of the phantastic nature of perception, right? But, as he argues, subjectivity is constituted and not constituent. At least the way in which, what appears to us is structured by modes of subjectivization, right? And, so this is where I then, so in the Topos of Noise piece, I'm referring to kind of this work, which is called the Atlas for Experimental Politics, and they're making use of Badiou's objective phenomenology to kind of argue about trying to think how that relates to kind of modes of resistance, to kind of forms of power. Let's say, let me just find some things here. So, the idea is that, certain forms of subjectivity will allow certain things to be perceivable and other things not, right? So the way in which perception is structured means that certain things appear and certain things do not. So certain things, certain things have a difference that makes a difference, and other differences go undifferentiated, effectively, right? We don't see what we don't see. And then there's a possibility then of kind of, systematically kind of revealing what is seen, or the structure of appearing, and how that can be transformed. The idea then is that all appearing happens within a world, but those worlds themselves can be transformed. The social worlds that structure those appearances. They're giving specific kind of tools for a kind of practices of resistance to that, which they call the experimental language of the situation. And I think, so going back to kind of the way, the fantastic nature of sound in this kind of multi-layered sense that I've tried to give, including, most importantly, kind of this socially structuring level. I think then, there's an important way in which music is can be thought of as a means of restructuring that world, the possibility of those worlds at both empirical and transcendental levels. And I will just say, and sorry, I'm going. There's many kind of connected threads here, but like the one of the kind of claims I'm making in this Topos of Noise piece, kind of at the beginning and at the end, is that there's something like a shift both in the image of thought and the form of power that from the early 20th century to the later towards the end of the 20th century. And that has to do with a shift from kind of robustness to noise, right? So if you think of like Shannon's work and Turing's work, they're both the notion of information there is one which is about kind of robustness to noise. So the ability to kind of minimize forms of noise, minimize or eliminate forms of noise. In this, there's a shift, though, I think, that happens in with the development of deep learning models, where the system is no longer kind of based around this kind of minimization of noise, but the noise becomes functional for the system, and so this is the idea of resilience. And again, this is true for the form of power. So, noise is no longer kind of something that is intrinsically critical of the form of power, but of contemporary power. Contemporary power kind of feeds on noise and demands it, and so in this situation, is noise in music critical anymore? Not in the same sense in which it was in the early 20th century. But I think it can be used critically. And okay, so just to kind of give you a little taster of that kind of, so one, okay, I called this piece, Topos of Noise, actually in reference to the book of Mazzola, Guerrino Mazzola, which is called Topos of Music. And, so there Mazzola is describing how music constructs an anti-world away from the tyranny of physical time. And, so he describes this in detail in the Topos of Music, but also in his other book on free jazz, where he's talking about a lot about, for example, the different ways in which jazz musicians are creating this anti-world. And I just wanted to quickly refer to an artist who I think is very interesting in this respect, and that's the artist's name is Slickback, who's released on Hyperdub as well as Hakuna Kalala, and so his music is like a kind of it's a kind of transgeneric mutant noise techno that is rooted in an inherent sense of disease and violent displacement. And so it's coming from Central Africa, and he's using, as I say, there's this transgeneric process where he's slipping between different genres and twisting or mutating the idioms in them. But there's also this very intense kind of experience of time there. So time in the anti-worlds of Slickback is in this kind of continuous state of unstable convulsions. There's this kind of ooze and gristle, swelling and contracting, and Mazzola talks about the time shards in the jazz of in certain artist. I've forgotten his name now, but so time shards are kind of hurtling everywhere like shrapnel in Slickback's music, and rhythms are collapsing into gnarled noise and then reconstituting themselves into lurching mutations. I think, effectively kind of, there's an urgent politics to this kind of relentless kind of evisceration and innovation of time. So club music is kind of mercilessly deconstructed. Sounds innards are repeatedly disemboweled and dissected, only to be kind of critically imagined and kind of surgically reconstructed. So there's a kind of, although kind of, but this is true also of Nazar, who calls this music weaponized kuduro, and that kind of references warfare more explicitly. But although this kind of chaotic rhythmic upheavals and sputtering percussion kind of evoke armed combat, I think they're far from, the kind of Italian futurist celebration of warfare. There's no kind of empty fetishization of turmoil here. This is a kind of cathartic evacuation of the military industrial trauma suffered in that region, and also an Afro-futurist or Afro-pessimist noise machine that hijacks and repurposes its sonic affects. Hopefully that that kind of made sense, this weird journey. Now we could maybe open it up for questions and see if I made any sense.
Inigo. Thank you so much. First of all, that was wild and full of stuff. I've got so many questions, but I wanted just to ask you maybe to backtrack a bit and clarify something or your position on something, because you covered so much, and it was just really, again, it was just really wonderful. And I've made so many notes, but I was wanting to ask you a bit more about this. I want to parse out like the difference between what we might be calling something like pure randomness that can be still available within a computational system, and what we might perceive from the human management position, if you like, the perception that you're talking about as being ambiguous. And I just want to ask you a bit more about that, because you mentioned both these words in some way or other, like through this talk. And I'm thinking that of how, certain, again, coming from the world of art, by the way, just saying, like, from my perspective, from the world of contemporary art, there's such a kind of pleasure in correlating ambiguity to the absolute idea of randomness. And of course, I would say that they're not the same. Are they, if you agree with that, for start off, are they not the same because we need different, to engage different positions of perception, or rethink perception as you're doing? So, for example, in the phantasmic brain, is there the capacity, what capacity is there for, let's call it scientificity or something, within that production of perception? And it seems to me that that's what your talk is really driving at. But maybe you'll disagree and say, I mean, basically what I'm saying is, it sounds like on the one hand, you've complicated this idea of it's all subjective, like the post-structuralist view. But at the same time, we are still left with the problem of perception and what that is, and how it, as you say, it produces these structures that are both that have. I'll just finish what I'm saying and then I'll shut up. So the structures that you're referring to seem to me to be really interesting, because on the one hand, the smoothness of the grass, let's say, is a very nice abstraction that allows us to see something in one, and it kind of inflate or deflates difference to commonality. So, and it produces this nice abstraction. And then also the edge of what is not grass, like what is concrete, for example, produces this border that you talked about of what is not grass. But that itself also has a kind of thickness of representational content, which is a different kind of abstraction. So my kind of question, which is conflating these ideas of, you know, this question of ambiguity versus the real, let's say, or something that is utterly more complex, yet could be computable in some form or other, or derives from computation even. And then I've got this vision that you've given me of two forms of abstraction that are not reducible to each other. So I don't really have a question. I'm just wondering what you think about my version or my understanding of what you said, and like where it leads you, and whether I've misunderstood something.
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. Yeah, this is a great question, and I'll try to get an answer. So, I mean, because it's talking about a couple of different things here, really. Because one is the, you know, concerning the processes, like the dynamic systems, you know, the cognitive agent as a dynamic system, and what, you know, the place of randomness and order, let's say, or structure in that, right? And then the other aspect is how that relates to art and the use of randomness or ambiguity in there, which, okay, so I mean, well, one thing straight off the bat is like, okay, I wouldn't, you know, I don't think there's any kind of pure randomness in, you know, for me, randomness, like noise, has, you know, is relative to theoretical framework. So there's various theoretical frameworks where we can define randomness, and I mean, the point, as I made a few times, is like, we're not, as cognitive agents, we're not kind of doing this some kind of neutral processing of information. So there's no kind of, yeah, so we're not kind of in contact with something like anything like a pure randomness, in, you know, because we're continuously in this process of you know, predictively kind of generating hypotheses about those structures, which are, you know, thicker, right? They're not formed from bits of information, right? Made up like that. Then, and that can be understood via, you know, so in the predictive processing kind of paradigm, that's effectively understood via the notion of compression, right? So there's a, you know, and in fact, I mean, what's kind of interesting is that the Shannon's idea, you know, Shannon's formalism, which was introduced, you know, where, you know, he explicitly kind of, you know, made that understanding of information by detaching it from the idea of meaning or semantics, right? So it's purely only considered in terms of kind of the reduction of surprisal. That formalism is what's been used to describe now meaning, right? So it's I forget his name now, the theorist who made it, but it's called the bottleneck effect, right? So the way in which for example, a deep neural net is able to extract a kind of image, a generative model of a dog from all of the kind of dog data it receives, is a process of compression, that abstraction, right, which kind of gets rid of a lot of kind of unnecessary details as noise, right? And kind of has a kind of it involves the kind of generation of an object recognition model, like a rule, that includes a intrinsic amount of variability or noise. So it's kind of, topological in itself, right? The deep neural nets can be understood as a topological turn in computing, because the object recognition is kind of, or the object's recognizability is built up in the latent space of the input data, right? And in terms of the cognitive agent, we understand this in terms of image schemata. But of course, image schemata are going to be very underdetermined, right? So, let's give it like this, so that, the example in my book I give is something like, okay, if there's a mole, and it wants to catch a worm, so it's got to have a kind of model of worm, the kind of sensory effects it would receive if there were a worm nearby, right? And so it's got a compressed kind of image of worm-like activity or worm-like sensory effects, which would then enable it to catch the worm, right? But of course, there's a huge amount of variability to the way a worm could wiggle, and like the model works as long as it catches enough worms, right? So it could be kind of fairly well off. The model could be way off, in fact. It's massively underdetermined. And, that's even more the case if you go up to more complex levels of cognition, right? So I think, let's put it like this: if there's so that process can be seen as an uncertainty reduction, right? Creating this generative model that fits just about well enough, right? That satisfies the conditions for survivability. But that doesn't mean that we can't have a better model or a different model that would completely restructure the appearance, right? So to me, then, that leaves open the whole possibility of constructing other appearances or constructing other worlds in which appearances can be. Relating that back to the question of art you wanted to bring up, I agree, of course. I think I argue a lot against the kind of fetishization of indeterminacy and noise in art processes, but at the same time, I think there is a critical use of indeterminacy, and there is a kind of a critical use of equivocation, ambiguity, and so on. All of these are can be kind of critical tools. It's just if they're kind of used. If my art just presents ambiguity, then that's not a useful presentation, right? But if it presents ambiguity between two things, which then makes me think in a new way about those things, then that might be useful, right? Similarly, kind of if it brings to if it points towards like fundamental indeterminacy of the physical world, like that maybe not telling me anything new, but if it points to some indeterministic processes that, you know, I can grasp why, then that might be useful, right? Does that help to answer?
One quick thing, because I know other people have got questions, but I guess that all I'm trying to think of really is that if there's a process by which we reorder things because there's a glitch, there's an error, we say error, but the error is so built into a processing system, it's almost, we don't live in the error, right? We're not going to dwell in it. It's just part of a process of ongoing conditioning to reformulate new stabilities in the environment. So my point really is that the very dwelling in the error and thinking that we can grasp that as a specific or space is impossible, because you've defined it as a part of a process that's completely relational. So for anyone to say I can sit in that error space, which would be the space of like the indeterminate or whatever, would not be sitting in it at all. It would be a kind of a meta level operation of a new additional form of picturing layered on top of that process, if you see what I'm saying. And that would be kind of contradictory. So I guess that's what I'm saying. Like, you either have it as part of a system or a kind of layer of representation on top of it. That's also part of a system of cognition, of course, but it acts like it's a kind of transcendental kind of production of an image of it, as if we can extract in the error from the process.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I mean, okay, well, I think here I think we've got to distinguish between, so I mean, firstly, the error signal is not, we don't have access to the error signal, right? So there's you know, it's the generative model which is updated to explain the error signal, to explain it away. So we usually don't even notice how our model differs from our actual sensory inputs. But, you know, that doesn't mean, you know, so the PP account, one of the benefits of it is that there's a kind of continuity between kind of sensory, perceptual, and cognitive functions, right? So then, you know, we can come to awareness about how some sensory experience is going against or not meeting our expectations. And certainly we can consciously kind of reason about how our expectations about things are wrong, right? So that, and I think that is a very important aspect of, like, you know, what it means to be kind of attentive to noise. Martin's got his hand up.
Yeah. So one thing really strikes me about the presentation, beginning with predictive processing, and that is you seem to admit that this is coming out of an individualistic model of subjectivity. And so there's a whole series of assumptions embedded in that, and that is that the subject is unitary and not a multiplicity, which also assumes that the noise is outside and not inside because of that multiplicity. And overall, there seems to be an embrace of, or one could say, of subsuming of all these newer schools of cognition, neurophenomenology, and activism, and so forth, but without buying into a very different set of assumptions which undergird those. so that it's almost like moving from predictive processing, which you rightly point to Kant as the progenitor, in part, that it's really a kind of not just subsuming, but a kind of colonization from a representational, computational perspective. And I think this is a real problem. And I can think of two examples where the issue of multiplicity comes into play. One is from art, with a nod to Amanda, and the other one is from music. So the one from art is the work of Arco and Gins, who talk about the architectural body, which is the person within the architectural surround, is able to propagate through that environment through what he calls what they call landing sites. So there's perceptual landing sites, there are imaging landing sites, and then there's a dimensionalizing landing sites. And the dimensionalizing landing site attempts to coordinate the imaging, which is direct perception. The perceptual landing site, which is direct perception, and the imaging landing site, which is really close to what you're talking about with aspects of predictive processing based on past experience. And I've also often described this in terms of the moment when I broke my nose, walking during an alumni event at my alma mater with a close friend, engaged in conversation with this fellow who I hadn't seen in a number of years, walking on a path to the student union, and then walking smack into a portico which had surrounded the front door of the student union, which was not on my imaging landing site because it had been put in there to save heat after I had already graduated, and literally broke my nose, and my friends tease me about this all the time. And that's an example of a multiplicity of cognition within the individual that are at cross purposes. Do you see what I'm getting at? And so that complicates the predictive processing model. The other one is when I refer to jazz as with reference to the specious present modeled by Varela, bringing neuroscience into phenomenology, where he talks about the 1/10 scale, which is the immediate data which enables interaction beneath the threshold of conscious awareness, and the 10 scale, which enables you to maintain the frame of the song form while you're improvising and interacting with other people, and that jazz musicians get lost when those two scales come into conflict with each other. Now, it seems to me that what you've been presenting really seems grounded problematically in an individualist perspective, even as you try to subsume, even things like ecological and social psychology. So I'm wondering, and it's also a problem I have with Mazzola, even in his free jazz book, that it's very much top down. And the fact that you use the reference to phantasm kind of reinforces metaphorically this top down European supremacy over cognitive models. So, anyway, so let me stop there and see how you respond.
Yeah, I agree with you that I think this is both of those examples you brought up were great and very helpful for understanding the what you call the multiplicity of the cognition and would be very useful for kind of countering this kind of individualist kind of assumption, let's say, that's embedded into the predictive processing. I think, you know, I guess, you know, I come from, I'm trying to work through from the perspective of predictive processing. So I guess I had to take that view to begin, you know, to understand it, and then I'm trying to get out of it at the end, right? But, you know, I think, you know, yeah, those are very helpful examples for that. And I think, you know, all the people I mentioned at the end, I didn't mean to subsume them under that model at all. To me, they are providing different routes for critically engaging with it on the basis, you know, and that, for example, Gibson's ecological psychology is intrinsically ecological. So it's not the individual, first of all, you know, then, you know, so, you know, Varela's work also, you know, all of those people are, you know, they're stressing a different, you know, starting point or starting assumptions, I think.
It was conversations. It was conversations with Ruben Barron, who's you know, was one of the leaders of the ecological psychology movement, and is friends with Gibson, and, you know, all of that, hanging out with him with Arakawa and Gins, that got me to start thinking about this, and the breaking of my nose, and, you know, all this other stuff, and which also led to, you know, this model of getting lost as the anomaly, which reinforces the model that I was trying to create, and so, can you continue with the predictive processing model if it's so clearly ensconced in an individualist, unitary subjective model?
I don't think it necessarily is. No, I mean, so I think, you know, there are various people who have interpretations of PP that are, for example, based on Gibson or in activist approaches, and you know, for example, let's say, you know, there's people like Brunberg and Ramsteds. They talk about, you know, they're talking about cultural affordances. So they're bringing up the idea of affordance to the level of kind of normative kind of structuring of behavior. And I think that's useful, but I also think, you know, I still think there's a difficult, you know, I don't want to, I feel like, you know, there's, and this is particularly kind of played out in the kind of the arguments between, for example, people like Paweł Gladziewski and Jacob Howie, who are very much on the side of representationalist, kind of computationalist understanding, and those on the kind of more inactivist and kind of ecological side. And it all hinges on the kind of the nature of representation. And, you know, so there's most of the kind of argument also draw on this kind of this what's called Ramsey's job theorem, understanding of representation. I think that can be criticized, but I think, you know, I think that we need something of both accounts to some degree, right? Because I'm definitely on the side of inactivist and ecological kind of arguments, in as much as they kind of critically kind of engage, you know, provide critical resources for going against this kind of individualist kind of model and the kind of neutrality of information. But wait, I still think kind of we do need to have a computationalist and representationalist understanding of thought that enables us to understand, you know, what it means when we have false inferences, what it means when we misrepresent, and so forth, right? And like I feel like the explanation for that requires a synthesis of those opposing positions at the moment.
I think that's also true, for example, for practice versus performance in jazz. I mean, absolutely. But to put in a good word for culture and cognition, are you familiar with the work of Edwin Hutchins?
Yeah.
Whose original work was on Micronesian navigational cognition, and then
I love that book.
I just love Hutchins' work. I've been a huge fan for a long time, and I'm just wondering whether his work figures into this at all, particularly with reference to affordances, from the bare feet of a shaman at the bottom of a boat, able to navigate for thousands of miles without sight of land, just by, feeling the swells versus the chop of wave motion. Anyway, so I was just wondering whether he had come into play at all.
To be honest, I haven't thought about Hutchins for quite a while, and I love that book. I read it quite a while ago, and I haven't thought about how it would relate to this predictive process. But that's an interesting point, and I'll try and think about it.
Well, as you say, careers as well as lives were at stake, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I appreciate the time.
I had a quick question if no one else wants to go first. Hello, Inigo. That was a very good talk, and there was, it covered a lot of ground, but it was very coherent, like a summary of lots of tendencies. I wondered if you talked somewhat about the image of sound. You talked about sound and the visual, and how reality is sometimes obscured or obscure. And I wondered if you have anything to say about the relationship between noise and perhaps the static ideology that sometimes quantification or the media or kind of hegemonic forms of thought obscure reality to a degree, and what is the relationship with noise there, do you think?
Big question. I mean, well, let me. I'll start by saying this and see if I can get to an answer. I mean, firstly, within the predictive processing kind of account, there's one of the problems that they're supposed to come to deal with is called the dark room problem, right? So it says if we're geared towards the reduction of uncertainty, then why don't we find ourselves in situations where there's no stimulus, right? Because stimulus is giving us uncertainty, then why don't we just go into low stimulus zones? And I think something like that is true though, right? So we don't find ourselves in dark rooms. And so this is the argument that PP generally makes. We don't find ourselves in dark rooms because that would not meet our expectations. So our expectation is that we receive a certain amount of uncertain stimuli, and actually being in a dark room is more uncertain because we start to fabulate stimuli. But then still, I think something like that does happen, right? And I think, let's say, for example, I think conservative attitudes toward music is something like a kind of an easy uncertainty reduction mechanism. If you say kind of oh, there's this kind of new, you've got this new stimulus, oh, that's just noise. You don't have to kind of explain it. You don't have to produce a hypothesis that explains why it's music. You're just oh, it's just noise. And similarly, I think, there's plenty of ways in which, say, for example, a very biased kind of, racist view could be seen as an effective uncertainty reduction mechanism, right? It's just oh, everyone's like this. Then my world is easy, right? So I think definitely kind of there's a way in which kind of received kind of culturally received ideas, forms of subjectivation, right, are kind of, effective uncertainty reduction mechanisms that are highly underdetermined, so that we could reduce uncertainty via another means, but this is just the easiest way that we have to hand because it's just been given to me, right? Does that kind of answer what you're talking about a little?
Yeah, that's very interesting to me, that because I'm currently like thinking a lot about how there's kind of dominant industries of society are often obstacles to actually apprehending situations that are actually much more uncertain than perhaps like mainstream narratives would present.
Yeah, totally. And I think so. This is why I really love this Atlas for Experimental Politics, because it's giving you like it gives a kind of like it gives these tools that can help for the collective navigation of those kind of the ways in which subjectivity is structured. And that's, I think they call it, what is it, intelligibility? I can't remember. There's a triad of interactions, right? Intelligibility, interaction, and so on. And the analysis of that gives the experimental language of the situation, which enables it to be transformed. It's great.
Hi, this is Katie.
Hi.
Hey, I'm currently driving, but I wanted to like contribute to the conversation, and hopefully I have paid enough attention to like cohesively connect all of these threads. And it's not really a question, but I just wanted to share a thought that I had towards the end of your conversation about subjectivity and like perception of like sound and noise. And it made me think about this by Lordeman, Moderator, and how it was written in like the late 1800s. Actually, no, like mid 1800s, like before the phonograph was created. And just thinking about these perceptions of sound,
Oh, your voice is breaking up a lot. I'm not sure we can hear.
Hello.
Hello. Yes. Yeah. There's a lot of interference there. Noise.
Hello?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Perhaps maybe I can write something about what I want to say when I get out of the car. I just drove the entire length of the Long Island Expressway. So, and well, yeah, I just wanted to share about this book, about how like the first kind of like moment of like oral history was actually recorded in this queer novel from the late 1800s in France. And I thought it was a really beautiful and poetic way to describe kind of what you were saying about how like mutant techno noise is kind of like a cry against the militant state. And I'm going to write about it in the chat or on the Discord later. But thank you so much.
That sounds very interesting. Oh, thank you. Yeah. No, that sounds great.
Sure. Right.
I didn't catch what the book was exactly, but
it's by Lordeman, and it's called Les Chants de Moderator. I might be pronouncing that wrong, but yeah, it's by Lordeman.
Great.
Written in 1868.
Write it down on the chat so we can access it. Thanks.
All right, cool. Bye, thanks.
Yeah.
I had a thought, actually, if I could ask something.
Sure.
Hi, yeah. I was I was going to ask something else, but then I just wanted to pick up on something that you said in the previous, your previous answer to one of, was it Andrew's question? Of course, I'm sure no one here would be, you know, the example you used around, I think you spoke about racism and how it's a kind of a form of, I can't remember the phrase you used now, but a way of kind of negating having to make any sort of decisions for certain people about, or having to kind of come to terms with a, you know, a broader reality, if you like. So I'm sure that no one would, no one here, I don't know people that well, but I'm sure no one here would be falling into that kind of very sort of dangerous trap, destructive trap rather. But I guess that kind of, that form of thinking is something that people do all the time, you know, but it's in a way it's a kind of, well, I would suggest it's a kind of malfunction, or it's a kind of crutch that people use in that particular context. But in another context, you know, to give a very kind of trivial, another kind of trivial scenario might be, you know, we know we know what we expect when we eat an apple, you know, but we're not necessarily going to get that experience every time, but we assume that we will when we eat the apple. If it's an apple, you know, all things being equal, it's not a kind of strange looking apple, or you could use any number of examples. And this is, you know, this is a kind of human cognitive, behavioral, sensorial process that we need as human beings. And I guess that this might link to what I was actually going to ask you about. I don't know, maybe it doesn't. Probably quite a naive question, but I think you speak in your, I very much enjoyed your text, but in the text you spoke, there's no but actually, I enjoyed your text, and I think the section, if I remember right, did it come from Andy Clark? I think you're kind of quoting him when you're speaking about how conscious experience, I think you present as a kind of likened to a kind of controlled hallucination, which I find quite interesting as a concept relating to some of my own work. And it's this kind of inferentially projected, it's like an inferentially projected hypothesis that we go through. Now, these are all things that I can kind of relate to, particularly in my practice. But I'm also wary of falling into a kind of idealist trap, you know, with that way of thinking. And further on in the essay, I think you speak about how when you bring in Badiou, when you're talking about how his example, when you're speaking about logic and how it is governed by intuition, I should say, this intuitionistic logic, and the way in which things appear to us through this process, if I'm getting this right. And I think, did I write the quote down? It's come to your typological kind of theme throughout the text. This typological logic he describes as a sort of pre-linguistic operations which ground the consistencies of appearances. Now, these are all things that I, you know, I don't have a problem with per se, but I know, you know, and something that I could almost have put myself, but if it was me, I would also be wary of this kind of idea where, also you speak about the example of color. Yeah, the example of color, that's very important. And it kind of echoes the Salarzian example of you know, the tie shop, the jobs in the tie shop, and how, you know, he's you know, it's this kind of long drawn out bloody thing, as Sellars, you know, always is, of this kind of you know, a man who doesn't know color basically, and he's kind of, you know, it looks one color outside and he's never seen it in different light and all the rest of it. But, and I think in your text, it's this idea that, you know, we see red under different, you know, we see it and we understand it under different sets of circumstances. But I guess if you follow that to its logical conclusion, or its extreme conclusion, one may say, is you get to a point where you say, well, there is no red, like red doesn't exist. Red is one of these hallucinations. You know, that's it. And it may be that we have this common experience of red, but ultimately, and this is something that I would reject, obviously, because I believe that out there is red. You know, now there can be all these external factors which create it, make it look green or make it look any other color you might want it to look. But there is a red, there is an essential red in the world. And if you're not colorblind or any number of things of the person perceiving it and the object itself or the color itself in the world. And therefore, there's probably a whole lot of other things that I could say about the text that could possibly be used as examples in this way. But these are the ones I'm remembering. What I would say then is, what would you say to this? You know, I presume you would also agree that there is a red. You know, there is a red, even if we don't necessarily see red, or everybody doesn't see the same red or whatever. You know, everyone doesn't taste the same apple, but there is an apple, or maybe there isn't. I don't know. Anyway, I hope that there's something like a question there.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there's lots there. Let me see if I can go through. So, I mean, I guess like you start talking about this example of the racist viewpoint and so on, and I think, you know, I mean, one thing to kind of note from on the PP kind of explanation, you know, all thought is bias, right? There is only bias, you know, and, you know, it's just a matter of which biases are the right ones, or practically for the animal or whatever. All thought is kind of abstraction and compression, but then, you know, there's still the question of like what level of compression is right, and what right is there is like, you know, maybe, you know, thought of practically in terms of how the organism wants to survive, but also might be thought of, you know, cognitively or conceptually in terms of like how we understand the world, right? So kind of, you know, I think that's something that's not really talked about very much in predictive processing theory. Like, so they just assume kind of we need to compress, but they don't say kind of, okay, but what are the why would you have this level of compression or that level of compression? Like, what are the reasons why those details need to be unfolded or not unfolded, and so forth, right? And I think, you know, I mean, so there's this book by Eric Baum called "What is Thought?" and he explains all thought is compression. And just all things are compression, in fact, you know, because the only things that exist are things that are compressible, right? Things that are incompressible are just not things. But it's like such a totalizing kind of understanding. I mean, like, let's just go back to that example. If you understand racism as a problem of faulty compression, then it's not the right kind of understanding, right? I mean, similarly, like they were talking, you know, there was this kind of, you know, the language models that were kind of, you know, coming up with sexist and racist statements and so on. And the scientists came up with this thing of hard debiasing the model. So you can kind of see the shape of the bias and then kind of just invert it. So it's just like, yeah. But so you can fix the bias of the model, but like, if it's just a matter of kind of adjusting the compression, then you haven't understood why, right? You know, and so there has to be a level of conceptualization about, and, you know, kind of discourse effectively about kind of, you know, why certain kind of images of the world, which are necessarily compressions, right, are correct or incorrect or socially reprehensible or not, for example, right? Then, I mean, so what else do we go on to? Then you're talking about color constancy and the existence of redness. This brings up a lot. I mean, so Metzinger talks about, for example, how like we see grass as green all day, but in fact it's kind of redder in the morning and bluer in the afternoon. So we're kind of computationally adjusting for color constancy. I mean, this is something similar to like this topological kind of understanding that I was trying to put there. Like similarly, you can play the tune "Happy Birthday" or another recognizable tune. You can play it in any kind of you can deform it quite a lot and people will recognize it, right? Or the sound of a trumpet, it's very different if you play it in a small room to a big room, or with a muting, but we still recognize its trumpetness because there's something, there's a structural invariant over it, right? And okay, so again, Metzinger is going to say, that our experience of red is a low-dimensional projection of a high-dimensional reality. So, in fact, the redness is way more complex than we can perceptually experience. But I would agree there is an objective reality of redness, or let's say the timbre of a trumpet. So it's a real thing. It's just that we have a low-dimensional kind of understanding of it. Like there's much more to discover about it than we can perceive immediately. And that there's ways in which we can train ourselves to do that, and perhaps ways that we still don't understand. You also were mentioning intuitionistic logic of appearing. I mean, the point of that was, okay, so it's intuitionistic because it's, so in the classical logic, you have it follows the law of excluded middle and the law of non-contradiction and so on. In this intuitionistic logic is different because something can appear to be something and not something, right? So it's become there's undecidability inherent to the situation of appearing. That was the point of that part. Hopefully that answered some of that.
No, that was great. Thanks.
Anyone else got a question? I could, meanwhile, read out this. So the book that Katie was talking about was L'Autremont, Les Champs des Moderator. Though the novel didn't create a big noise at the time, pivotal scene, chant 2, stanza 8, describes the birth of hearing. The narrator, the main protagonist, informs the audience that has been deaf since birth until confronted with the truly horrific scene of an anthropomorphic creature, that one who calls himself the creator, sitting on the throne of shit and coal cloaked in hospital sheets. Wow, that sounds great, that book. Okay, anyone else have questions or comments they want to raise? The Topos of El Topo, yes. Where's the place of glitch here? There's an error signal generating more noise. Where is the place of glitch? I don't know. I mean, to me, like the term glitch is kind of intrinsically digital in some ways. So I'm not sure about that. The cognition is the way that brains compute is not digital. Neither is it analog. It's kind of sui generis. So it's something in between both of those. The glitch, I guess, I mean, though what we could say is I mean, I guess, yeah, I kind of a glitch is the results from the material specificities of the programming system or the system that you're using, and I guess there's similar kind of effects in cognition. So there's a certain degree of noise. I mean, like, so for example, let's say in auditory system, the auditory nerves are continuously stochastically firing. So there's a stochastic noise in the ear, in this kind of active process of the auditory nerves, which are kind of dancing. So they're kind of randomly dancing always. But then when a frequency that falls within the bounds which they respond to, so they're lined up in terms of which frequency they're responding mostly to, they jump more in a more ordered way. Their dancing becomes more ordered, further from randomness. So the recognition of a signal is this kind of like group effect of the auditory nerve fibers kind of collectively moving to the beat. And one interesting thing as an aside here is that auditory nerve fibers, they're the fastest moving biological thing ever found, and they're moving at the same rate, more or less, as the inputting as the sensory input, right? So, which is very different from the eyes, right? Light is way too fast to compute the in terms of wavelengths and so on, right? So there's something very different happening in the processing of the sensory signal in auditory terms from other sensory modalities because of the speed of sound and the speed of like the auditory nerve fibers, right? So effectively they're operating at the same speed, so yeah, there are kind of noise affects this. So for example, I mean, so you've got distortion tones and various kind of nonlinear kind of effects in the auditory system that where we hear something that is not there out in the world, right? And as a result of the material specificities of the way that sound is being processed. So it's, I guess, something similar to glitch in that respect. Does that help, or does that make sense? Going to say, I mean, I think in some ways, as a kind of general problem with predictive processing, the one I mentioned already, the individualistic account, but also, I mean, I think just it's a very baggy explanation, to say all perception, action, and cognition is directed towards uncertainty reduction, because as its long-term average reduction of uncertainty, everything fits in this model, and so there's no way of kind of falsifying it. You can't say, oh, but this doesn't reduce uncertainty, because that, you know, as long as it fits the long-term average reduction of uncertainty, it's okay. And yeah, so I feel like kind of once everything is explained under the same kind of explanation, it explains nothing. You know, if everything is uncertainty reduction, then what am I doing in this instance, right? So that's one aspect, and there's other kind of, you know, technical kind of issues related to you know, the specificity of for example, the boundary of the you know, the uncertainty reduction system. You know, is it the brain? Is it the body? Is it the skin? You know, does it relate to, you know, does it go down to bacterias? You know, viruses which don't have such kind of boundaries, you know, this kind of thing. It's there's a lot of problems with the kind of over kind of you know, this kind of, what do you call it, overarching kind of explanation for everything, right? Yeah, I should say as well, I mean, I think, you know, one issue with talking about the fantastic nature of sound, I don't want to kind of present kind of an ableist picture of this, right? So, and especially kind of when we're talking about the kind of you know, the importance of this kind of co-development of proto-languaging and proto-musicking. So I think the way to kind of counter an ableist kind of understanding of that is through the notion of gesture, which, so gesture, you know, musicking and languaging are both forms of gesture, and gesture is the fundamental thing. So intelligence, the intelligence that developed through musicking and languaging also developed in the deaf communities, and it's not a matter of just sound, it's the kind of way in which there's a gestural unfolding of you know, image schemata and so on in language, and, you know, be it sign language or whatever, right? And yeah, I think I mean, so the Mazzola's discussion of the diagram is very useful here. So he's drawing on Deleuze's discussion of the diagram, people like Cavaillé and people. So it's French gesture theory understood as this kind of constitutive act of perception. So space and time are not given, but they're produced through kind of a gestural unfolding. And then, you know, so I think, you know, another artist I talk about is Klein, who I think her music can be usefully understood in terms of a kind of process of diagramming. So, you know, away from a kind of ontological explanation of her use of samples, I think her use of samples are not kind of referring back to kind of lost futures, but they are kind of a diagrammatic exploration of the contemporary, of forces in the contemporary. Yes. Goodbye, some people. Okay, if we don't have any more, then we can, I guess we finish now.